Well, with more on the Tiananmen Square massacre now, I'm joined in the studio by James Creedon. He's been looking at all of the coverage of this online. And of course, in China, there is zero coverage of this today. As we just saw, young people don't even know what happened on June 4th, 30 years ago.
It's kind of extraordinary.
Really extraordinary. And people were, and we saw Charles and his team was showing people that famous image that we in the West all know of the young student standing in front of the tank. And we all know what happened a few minutes later.
That's right. And the fact that his identity is still a mystery 30 years later. The New York Times has done a big piece on that. Tank Man remains an icon and a mystery 30 years on. They say, one quote from that, "In an age of cyber sleuthing and intense media scrutiny, it has become almost impossible for historical figures to remain anonymous. But Tank Man, bizarrely, still is." Now, actually, here in another iconic square, public square, Place de la République in Paris, there was an event today organised by the French ONG ACAT, which is an organisation against torture and the death penalty. Devenez Tankman, why don't you become Tankman? So what they essentially did is they invited members of the public to come along, which they promptly did, to pose on front of a fake tank in, I suppose, honour of the bravery of that student who still remains anonymous all these years later. So that was a little, I suppose, commemoration today in Paris's Place de la République. But indeed, I suppose Paris, known for its own, unrest over the years. For example, May 1968. It's unimaginable that, for example, an event like May 1968 would be unknown to people today. I mean, perhaps uncomparable events in some respects. Obviously, there were no, the Tiananmen Square was hundreds of deaths,
possibly thousands.
Yes. But to think that kind of a huge moment like that would be unknown to people a generation down, it's pretty amazing. Now, speaking of being wiped from history, Le Nouvel Observateur is talking about how 30 years later there is a battle to save those images of Tank Man and therefore the memory that goes with it. One protester who was there on the day by the name of Yang Jianli wants it to be inscribed in the Register of World Memory at UNESCO here in Paris. So there is an attempt for those images, and I suppose all that accompanies it, the memory of the event, to be kind of inscribed in a world memory bank, if you like, at UNESCO. So,
and I wonder if we will ever know who that gentleman was.
Well, 30 years later we don't, so maybe some clarity will come at some point.
Big mystery, that one. And of course, Chinese artists have also been marking the occasion. Dissident, I guess you're going to talk about Ai Weiwei, but...
Ai Weiwei, indeed. I'll get to him in 2 seconds, but a guy who actually worked alongside him when Ai Weiwei was in Berlin, because of course he's been based in various parts of the world, is a guy called Badiou Cao. Now that's a pen name, stage name, not his real name, because...
And does he live in China? He works in China?
He lives in Australia.
Ah, okay.
But his family lives in China. And for the first time today, Laura, he actually revealed his face.
Wow.
Because he...
Very brave.
Very brave.
There could be implications for his family.
Well, that's exactly it. And this is how he was always masked. I'm not sure how clear that image is, but you get a sense. Yeah. And his family, some months back, were approached and threatened, essentially, if he continued to do what he's been doing in terms of dissidence. He explained, the New York Times is also writing a piece about that. In 2007, when he was a law student, he saw a video. Essentially, he was at law school, and with his roommates, he was watching a pirated movie, which suddenly cut to a documentary that was spliced in, talking about Tiananmen, and that's when he discovered the truth of what happened.
Incredible story.
And it shifted his whole life story around, because
he never would have known.
Hadn't heard about it, and it moved him towards activism and art, and so you can see some of his If there's one image, if I can find it, I think it's here, where he kind of he dressed up as Tank Man in this performance art piece in Adelaide, and a lot of his cartoons and political cartoons have been very much critical of the authorities. You mentioned Ai Weiwei. He had a piece in The Guardian today, very critical of the West in this piece, basically saying that they are complicit in the cover-up. Why? Because there is an increasing tolerance of injustice and distorted information, and that is kind of almost an encouragement or complicity. We will all pay the price for this failure. In other words, Western countries should really be brave enough to stand by their ethics and not bow down to them. There's one cartoon that I'll show as well, Laura, that kind of picks up on that. This is by a Swiss-German cartoonist. You can see there that this is a replication of the Tank Man, the iconic Tank Man image, and what you have is, I suppose, the might of Chinese industry and exports against, I suppose, the international community looking on somewhat less brave than they might have been in the past.
Well, we heard some pretty tough words from the US Secretary of State.
That's true.
Against China today.
That's true.
Saying, hopes of it ever becoming a democratic state have been all but abandoned. But yeah, you're right. Everybody does business with China.
That's
big
right.
country,
There's more
big
and more compromises in that regard. Interesting as well, just to look at this piece from Quartz. It's a little bit different in Hong Kong, of course.
Very different, yeah.
Where crowds of people have marked the anniversary for years and years and years. But apparently there's a generation gap emerging, and younger generations are feel that there's maybe too much attention being focused on remembering Tiananmen, and actually this is in some respects it promotes Chinese nationalism, which emotionally binds Hong Kong people to the Chinese nation. And what they're basically saying is it diverts attention from Hong Kong's own struggle for democracy.
Yeah.
So actually younger people in Hong Kong a little bit less enthusiastic.
And obviously a very different message in the Chinese state media. Very quickly.
Just very briefly. June 4th, immunise China against turmoil. They're basically saying all of these noises will have no real impact on Chinese society. The actions of external forces are completely in vain. Right. So a defiant message from, really a mouthpiece for the Chinese government, Global Times.
James, thank you very much. James Creedon there. We're going to take a short break. Don't go away.